welcome. So this morning we are continuing obviously through Acts 19. We are specifically in verses 21 to 27. Essentially the rest of this chapter, or this closing 20 verses basically of this chapter, 21 to 41, is the one portion, it's the one story. We're just going to divide it into two so we can focus on each portion better. It's concerning a riot that breaks out in Ephesus. Verses, what we're doing this morning, verses 1 to 27, Luke lays out the ground or the reasoning for why this occurs. So he's kind of setting the scene. And then 28 to 41 is wherein the riot and the upheaval then occurs. So both weeks are to be taken back to back. Not just obviously in the fact that we flow from one to the other, but to keep in mind that
20 or 21?
21. Yep, chapter 19, verses 21. So I'll read the passage, Acts chapter 19, verse 21 to 27, and then we'll go from there. Alrighty. So, Acts chapter 19, verses 21 to 27. Now after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem, after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, "After I have been there, I must also see Rome." And having sent into Macedonia two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. Now about that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen there. These he gathered together with the workers of similar trades, and said, "Men, you know that our prosperity is from this business. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable crowd, saying that things made with hands are not gods. Not only is there danger in this trade of ours, so that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be considered as worthless, and that she, whom all of Asia and the world worship, is even about to be brought down from her majesty." Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, as I mentioned in the little introduction, this passage flows into the ending of the chapter, and so verses 21 to 41 are the one and the same set of story. But these verses here, 21 through 27, is Luke essentially giving the backdrop or the backstory, setting the stage of the reasoning for what then comes next in the next lesson next week with regards to this riot that then breaks out. So there's a number of obviously contextual details we'll explain, but also some actually very significant theological and sociocultural points we'll draw out to as well as we go through. So, verse 21. Now after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia. So to go to Jerusalem, and again, that's where that'll be concerning particularly the next chapter and the chapter after it, chapters 20 and 21, especially 21. Passing through Macedonia, so northern Greece, we've gone through that region, particularly in the second journey. For those who have been joining us during that period, Achaia is the province of what we might just generally call southern Greece. So the province of the Roman province of Achaia covers what today we call the Peloponnese or southern Greece. So after having passed those kind of areas, like where Corinth is, for example, he has purpose to go to Jerusalem. And he says, after I've been there, I must also go to Rome. That is to say, after I've been to Jerusalem, I must go to Rome. For Paul getting to the heart of the empire was what he very clearly understood to be a significant move, or his most significant move. Now, the way that this occurs, without spoiling it, is in chains, but we'll get there eventually.
Twist, yeah.
Yes. And that was all purposed accordingly. But again, we'll get there when we get to these later chapters. Yep.
Just a quick pronunciation. I've always pronounced it Macedonia.
Sure. Yeah, it's hard for me in my head because I'm at times reading it in Greek. For me, often I'll revert back to, if I said Macedonia. Macedonia is, in English, you'd say it as Macedonia. Yeah.
But Macedonia, you're saying it in the Greek way, are you?
Because I spend so much time in the Greek, half the time when I read a name, I don't even realise they've just said. So if I just said Macedonia, that's because in my head I was saying.
No. I was curious if there's a different pronunciation.
No. In Greek, in English, Macedonia is perfectly acceptable. Yes.
I wasn't correct. I was just curious.
No, that's fine. Sometimes, so for example, it's when with names at times, if I spend a lot of time reading it in the Greek, I'll just kind of naturally default, either intentionally or unintentionally, depends on the name.
There's some horror verses that you have to get up during Bible reading, and no matter how much you practice it before you get up, you still massacre the names.
Yeah, look, the fortunate thing is that the meaning of the meaning of text isn't dependent on our ability to pronounce certain words.
No, thank goodness for that.
Yeah, no, in my head as I'm reading it, sometimes
like I said, I was just curious.
Macedonia is in English Macedonia.
Sorry.
No, that's perfectly fine. The soft C comes from what we call ecclesiastical Latin and the consonantal shift, and I won't bore you with the history of the Latin language, but anyway, K became S. So that's how we got the letter C. Anyway, point being, Macedonia, Achaia or Achaia, and yes, anyway, it goes to Rome. We'll cover how that unfolds, but this is in essence foreshadowing, because keeping in mind Luke is writing this after the fact, of course. So it's foreshadowing that trip to Rome. In verse 22, and having sent into Macedonia, or Macedonia, or whichever you like.
See that word the same way.
Or whichever way you like to say it. Two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So again, the province of Asia in western, what today would be Western Turkey. On a side little note, it also makes it easy and difficult sometimes. So Timothy is the English, very simple English. In Greek, his name Timotheo. Erastus is just simply a transliteration of the Greek. So Timothy is easy to say because it's in English. Erastus is actually just the Greek name that we've decided to keep that way. But point being, continue on. So he stays in Asia, and again, this is all just simply Luke setting the stage for really what's unfolding here for us in 23. Now, about that time, there occurred a great disturbance concerning the way. Right? So no small disturbance is the way that Luke often phrases it. No small disturbance or a great disturbance concerning the way. And we've covered this before. The way, capital W, was a common early term for Christianity, taken from the words of Christ in the Gospels. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And so calling it the way is often how it was referred to in the first century and beyond for a while. Verse 24, for a man named Demetrios, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, again, we laid a lot of that groundwork in the previous lessons, was bringing no little business, i.e. a lot of business, and a lot of profit is the literal rendering there, is in P-R-O-F-I-T, so profit is in money, to the craftsman. Artemis was the patron goddess of, obviously not just Ephesus, but also really all of Asia, all of Western, the Western Anatolian Peninsula, as we call it, Western Turkey. This region was steeped in history. It had a long-standing Greek history going back, well over 1,000 years at this point, well over 1,200 years really. And Artemisian worship in this part of the world and this part of the broader Hellenic world, or Greek world as we call it, was massive. As a result of that, and we've also, for those who've been in our church history classes, we've seen this as well with regards to the empire, the Roman Empire generally. The religion and the culture and the economics are intertwined, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, a good thing. It's just kind of a matter of fact. You know, by the time you get to the medieval period in Europe, and of course now Christianity is the religion of the continent. You know, silversmiths are no longer building, to use this example here, silversmiths are no longer building pagan idols, but rather are helping to build churches and cathedrals, right? So these various elements being tied into one another is not so much a uniquely or distinctly pagan thing. It's just a human thing that is really an inevitable facet of society and of life.
This was all about grift. It was all about money first,
yeah.
And it's shown to be about money. Yeah. And then they overlaid it with, but it's going to remove our God or whatever.
Correct, and that's exactly the twist that then comes. Yeah.
Yeah. So they just buried it under the real motive underneath.
Correct.
Another one.
Yeah, and that's where this passage then leads us, and that's the point of distinction.
Reminds me of someone else in the US. I don't know.
Well, yeah, we have these things we have these kinds of, and that'll be a point that I'll draw out later with regards to things even today. The way in which this takes a turn, though, is in regards to the underlying purpose, which is what's being highlighted there. The silver shrines. Well, it's not just silver shrines. There's a whole broader economic factor. This is just Luke highlighting on the core of this particular incident. But the silver shrines of Artemis, of course, at the famous Temple of Artemis, which we talked about last week, one of the seven ancient wonders, or seven wonders of the ancient world, was a massive temple. Was the center of cultic worship in that entire region of the world, essentially. And was renowned for then, of course, the broader economic surrounding of the temple itself, which you're getting an insight into here. The connection between the worshipful elements, or the more distinctly religious elements, and the economic ones is what actually outlines what we then will look at next week, and what the kind of consequences are and why this was such a thing. But in simple terms, he says and explains in verse 25 what the core of what I'm addressing is. If you look at verse 25, these, as in the craftsmen, right, who would then obviously build and sell the idols, these he gathered together with the workers of similar trades, so beyond just silversmiths, stonemasons and woodworkers and other such things as well, and said, "Men, you know that our prosperity is from this business." Okay, our prosperity is from this business. There was an entire culture of economic gain and profit and prosperity from the religious institution of, in this case, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, and everything that flows out from there beyond Ephesus itself. This is the kind of perverse way in which the religion of man can be twisted into all these kinds of deceitful and grifty and greedy and monetarily lustful kind of practices and systems. It's why, and various different, especially more kind of cultic breakoffs from Christianity tend to be that way as well. And it's something which at various different times, on and off in different ways throughout the last 2,000 years, this kind of not just mentality, but really this kind of way of doing religion has at times then started to seep into the church, right? The kind of modern atheistic notion that this has just always been the way that Christianity is like that from start to finish is a laughable misreading of history, especially considering how central especially the medieval period and even the early church to a degree, asceticism and vows of poverty have been, not that those are meant to be universally taken, but there are, especially in the monastic life of the medieval church with monasteries and such, vows of poverty or vows of asceticism were a pretty key function. You find this kind of mentality of the intermingling and basically almost the codependency, the kind of symbiotic relationship between religion and economics play out even today in various religious settings. I'll start outside of Christianity first and then work my way back in. Islam is notorious for this. Muslims have a very unabashed, unashamed love affair with riches and luxuries and fine things, especially when they're in positions of power or in a status of power. In other words, they're the majority, so vis-a-vis the Middle East. The entire city of Dubai is essentially the very outworking of exactly what I'm talking about here. Dubai in the United Arab Emirates is a modern metropolis, desert metropolis built essentially in the last 20 to 30 years on Western tourism and Western kind of expat culture, where supposedly under heavy, the Emiratis are as committed, so it were, to Sharia law and the other Islamic customs as any of their neighbours are, but they make that quite lax for certain Western tourists or expats when they come, whilst having built a city essentially on the back of slave labour from the subcontinent and from Africa. The decadence, luxuries that is kind of the sign that you are blessed by Allah, is something which is then seen in the way that, for everyone from Saudi princes to Qatari sheikhs and so on and so forth. This also is the case in Hinduism, especially with regards to its caste system. The various, basically, ontological strata or stratification of people into the various castes or levels of society, from the highest Brahmins, who are the most valued, who are the richest and who are the wealthiest and who are held to be so because they deserve to be so, as compared to the bottom of that proverbial rung in Indian society of the untouchables, whose name is fairly self-explanatory, who are nothing but a curse and a plague upon society. The Christian ethic and the Christian ethos turns all those various things upon their head. It turns the intermingling of greed and lust for money completely apart and aside, by virtue of the fact that monetary gain, profit, money, wealth, riches, etc., can be a sign of God's blessing, but do not automatically necessitate it. That's point number one. And this is the story of Job. People either often confuse it for one of two things. They either confuse it on one side for stating that monetary or like wealth and wealth generally is always a sign of blessing from God, and that the lack of it is therefore a sign of a lack of God's blessing. Or they then look at how the story plays out and how Job loses essentially everything, and then take that as wealth is never a sign of God's blessing because look at how it turned out. Except the balance is actually the fact that it's not an either or, but it really is actually a both and. Do you understand? It's not either or, it's actually both and. Job actually, the book of Job is pretty clear in the point that it makes, that Job as a wealthy man, many livestock and a successful household and a lovely family and blah, 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 thriving business and so on and so forth, renowned or position of esteem and status in society, that was because he was blessed by God. Okay. It then also goes to the effort of making the exact same point when Job is essentially rendered asunder with nothing. Right? In that Job is still blessed by God.
And still faithful.
And still faithful, yeah. Right. And so the point is actually not either or, but really both and. So God blessing his people with a home that is safe, with a loving family that's growing and is flourishing and doing well in life, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Various things that we just call prosperous in whatever machination you have of that word, is absolutely a blessing from God, because God is the giver and taker of all things. Right? Giver and taker, both sides. You don't get one without the other. And so hence, when the scriptures say over and over again, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. When things are taken away, it's entirely possible that it's a result of your own actions, because despite the blessings of God, actions still have consequences in the world. We don't get to escape that magically because of faith. At the exact same time, vis-a-vis the story of Job, it's entirely possible that things are taken from you with really no doing of your own hand. Right? And so the point that then gets drawn, that's why Job is in this section that we call the wisdom literature, that's why it's a piece of wisdom, is that the wisdom, well, there's many points of wisdom drawn from Job, but one of the more central points of wisdom drawn from Job is that because God is the giver and taker of all things, and i.e., or in other words, he is sovereign over all matters, we can then actually have confidence and trust that whatever heights we may ascend to or whatever depths we may plummet to, God still remains sovereign through that, and that he is the object of our trust.
And right there beside us.
Correct, exactly. Yeah,
right there.
Exactly correct. And so this is why then seeking to use religious institutions or systems or mechanisms for financial gain or for profit, FIT, is so morally egregious.
I looked up if they actually found any of these silver statues, and there's a few.
Yeah, a couple. We found a couple of them.
And they're 5.7 feet high.
Yeah.
They're not small.
No, they're big. The famous statue of Artemis is about as tall as me.
Yeah. And it's the woman's got about 16 breasts.
Yeah, because she was associated with fertility.
Well, they think it's either breasts or...
Yeah, we're not sure what they are.
Bulls, gonads, they're not sure. And
I'll explain why in a minute, yeah.
She's got all down the front of her a whole stack of bulls or cows on like an apron.
Yep.
And there's actually even a statue, a fountain, where all the water's all coming out of these.
Oh, that's attractive.
Yeah, we're not sure. We're not, because we...
Whereabouts, what museum are they in?
I believe one's held in the British Museum.
I've not seen that.
Don't quote me on that, but I'll go and have a look. I can look it up very quickly, fortunately. We're not sure exactly what the various domes, as they might be broadly called, refer to. Artemis was associated with fertility, which is kind of ironic because she was actually a virgin in the mythology. But it's mainly because she was primarily goddess of nature and of the hunt or of hunting. So if you were going out to hunt a deer for food that week, Artemis would be an extremely important person to consult. But the specific statue, I would need to go. I know exactly what you're talking about. I just need to go and find.
Well, she's got a deer on either side of her as well.
Yes. Okay. So actually, no. It's held at the one you're referring to. Is actually held at the Ephesus Archaeological Museum.
In Ephesus, yeah. It was dug up at Ephesus, I think.
Okay. Is it this one?
Is it? No. That's another one.
Fair enough.
So it's
How many
this.
did you say there were?
It's this one.
There's about 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's this one.
Okay, that one I've never seen before. The other ones I've seen when I've been to the Ephesus Archaeological Museum.
Yes,
But that one's the one with the bulls. I'm not quite sure. But the reason why that would be associated is because bulls or cattle generally were what was then sacrificed to her. Anyway, point being that this, to circle back to the concept we're talking about, this kind of what you're seeing unfold in this particular portion of the Book of Acts is the same kind of underlying ethos or philosophy that that brings Christ to go to town on the moneylenders in the court. What was going on there, in a brief synopsis to remind you, was that you had Jews in the outer court, or the court of the nations, or the court of the Gentiles, as it's sometimes called, which was the whole purpose of that outer court in the temple structure was serving a very important symbolic kind of purpose, namely that the Gentiles were to be brought into the covenant. Right? And this is going all the way back into the Old Testament with the building of the temple, of the Solomonic temple, the Temple of Solomon. All this was foreshadowing the nations coming into the covenant. Yet here, in this time period in the first century, the Jews were then grifting and selling religious items and such things, particularly doves, birds, and other such things, and a variety of other things for sacrifices, that then they could make money off the Gentiles, who happened to be what we call God-fearers, right, or those who are observing the covenant, and making a profit off of them, right?
Indulgences?
Not quite. That's a different concept. But indulgences, I suppose, is somewhat along those practices. That one, that one is. I've seen that one too. That one I know from. That one I think. That one I think is actually over in Italy, off memory.
Villa Este Trevilli.
Via d'Este in Trivoli, Italy. Yeah.
Trivoli. Yeah.
And so yes. No, Artemis's worship was pretty widespread.
That's from Wikipedia.
Yeah, and so yes, and so Christ, he says, "You have turned my house into a den of thieves," and people making a profit off it, and especially in that case, exploiting the Gentiles for money, is essentially what was fundamentally going on there. And so he crafts a whip and gets to work.
So it's not something that's just done straight out of anger, right? He sat down, he's
not
found
anger.
the materials,
Yeah,
he's built himself a whip,
Yeah,
and then he sets himself to it. It's like,
Either think one or two. There's two common erroneous misinterpretations of the passage, which is that one, it's a reactionary emotional
tantrum.
kind of. Yeah, that it's him seeing it and flying off into a rage. That's the text doesn't indicate that at all, or that he drove them out of the temple by asking them nicely to leave. Right? That's both sides of that equation are equally wrong. It doesn't. It's not. He wasn't carrying a whip around with him. He built one, which didn't take 10 seconds to do. It took a lot longer than that, and the word that gets used there is pretty obvious. It gets used all the time in texts talking about conflict and warfare and fighting. He started flipping tables and pushing and dragging and beating those guys up and getting them out of the temple. Now the problem is that the reason why people tend to fly into one of those two different, either it was purely an emotional reaction, or especially the more common one, which is that Jesus asked them to nicely form a neat line.
I've never heard that second.
The second one, I hear it all the time. Yeah, I hear it all the time.
I suppose it's a way of trying to explain why the temple guards were obviously there.
Yeah, correct.
Did nothing.
Yeah, did nothing. And why do you think that might be?
Oh, maybe he asked them nicely to leave.
Yeah. The temple guards are all standing around doing nothing, which means that they're in on it. That's the natural implication. Yeah, correct. The latter I hear all the time. It's really in evangelical Protestant circles generally, but that wasn't a nice little affair. And the reason why people come up with that latter interpretation all too often, in my experience, is because they've got it in their head that they've got the kind of nice hippie Jesus kind of image already,
Yeah.
like the nice, the soft, dainty, lush, moisturized hands type of view of Jesus, which is not at all, not at all correct.
No, it's not.
And they confuse the fact that when it talks about Christ humbling himself, which he did, I explained that in part on the weekend, at least in passing reference. The humbling of Christ was him condescending to our level. In other words, the eternal God becoming man and stepping down to our level in order that he would then raise us up. Right?
I'm guessing the reason was, the temple guards probably said to the priest, "Psst, well, can we get?" And the priest said, "No, he's quoting from scripture.
Yeah.
If we do that, we're going to look like idiots."
Yeah, exactly. We're going to look at idiots. Yeah, correct. 100% correct. And so it forgets the fact that in that humbling and in the various, you see him talk about, the meek shall inherit the earth, which is true. And then again, you then end up formulating this erroneous erroneous view of who you think Jesus was, as soft and nice and polite and dainty and gentle. Yes, correct. Gentle with those whom he should be gentle with, right? So gentle, gentle, a level of gentleness and compassion that allows the little children and infants to be brought to him, right?
I think C.S. Lewis.
He did, yes, correct.
Well,
Yeah, he did. Yes.
He's a huge, big lion, okay, and soft and cuddly, yada yada, but he's not quite a tame lion.
Yeah,
He's
correct. Another
scary
timeline.
lion.
Yeah, and that's of course in his, as he writes the Chronicles of Narnia and whatnot. That image comes out really clearly. The same at the same time, he's also able to witness evil, because it's straight up evil. Like it's financially abusive practices of seeking monetary profit off of the Gentiles, none of which was ordained by God. It was completely, their entire justification was rabbinical traditions that were a couple of hundred years old. That was their justification in their head. And so they were choosing the traditions of men over the words of God, right? And so in the face of that evil and that abuse, especially tied in with the love or the lust of money, he drives them out and does so physically.
Yeah, I think so. I've never had personally an issue with Jesus becoming so angry in the direct presence of evil like that, because it's like oil and water. It's like that ain't happening. That is
It's not our type of anger. It's because, like I said, he sat down and he did that in total cold blood. He just.
Yeah, what I'm saying to you, the forming of the whip is why. That's the reason why I'm pretty sure it's John that includes that detail specifically, because it actually gets mentioned. It's one of the rare instances in which it features in all four Gospels. Right, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels because they have the same synopsis essentially. They're structured differently. They're for different audiences. Like really, and you can tell that especially when you read the way it's written and the kind of cross references it makes. Matthew is really clearly directed towards Hebrews or like the Jews. Luke is clearly directed towards Greeks, and Mark is pretty clearly directed towards Romans. Right, but John is then the one that's distinct. It's not. It doesn't include the nativity scene, for example. It just begins with Jesus' ministry and life. It's the last of those written, so the synoptics have already been written first. At certain points, it's not even chronological. It's actually thematically built around these seven I am statements that Christ makes, or where he identifies himself as God. There are certain points that are not even chronological. Which is fine because it's not designed to be. Once you realise what John's actually trying to do, the specific chronology isn't actually a factor in John's gospel. It's there, but there are things that are clearly, when you read the synoptics, are actually out of place, but that's because he's not trying to put them in place.
and then your person says, "Aha! Look at John, right? It doesn't match with Matthew."
Yeah, and that comes from them.
It's obviously a mistake in translation.
It's a mistake. It's been corrupted because it's out of order. No, you're not understanding what the purpose of them are. But so many of the stories are in the Synoptics, but not in John, or they're in John, but not in the Synoptics. Just because they've got different purposes in being written, like any author has, right? It's a very normal thing. But that story with Christ and the moneylenders in the temple, in the outer court, is actually in all four. And usually, as a general rule of thumb, if something's in all four Gospels, it's probably pretty important. Why do I point that out? Because in the face of that egregious, just completely morally bankrupt evil that was being practiced, he didn't stand by and do nothing, or arguably as worse yet, he didn't go about it nicely and politely. Okay, because modern, and this is going to be a bit blunt, but ta-da. Often in a lot of Protestant circles today, in a lot of evangelical circles today, there's kind of an 11th commandment of "Thou shalt be nice." that tends to prevail in Western civilization, and it's not there. There's a different. It's a failure to understand the difference between nicety and compassion. Okay. Compassion, divine attribute. Love, divine attribute. All these things. Niceness. Kind, again, the difference, even more specifically, the difference between being kind and being nice. Kindness as an outwork. Kindness is really just the practical outworking of compassion. Compassion leads someone to be kind toward or demonstrate kindness towards someone. Is different and distinct entirely from being nice. Nice, you can probably hear it if you know French. Nice has French origins in its etymology, and it goes back a couple of hundred years, I think about to the 1600s or 1700s, and originally was not a positive term. Nice was...
It sounds superficial,
Does it just mean wimpy, did it? Or?
Yeah, nice was what in England would be called a dandy. What really in biblical terms would be described as effeminate. Not feminine, feminine good. Yeah. Women, feminine good. Effeminate, similar but completely different, is men who are not acting like men, right? Men who are not actually upholding their responsibilities as men. Men who are acting more like women, not because acting like women is the problem, but because they're not women and they're men and they're acting like women, effeminate, right? So not feminine, but effeminate. And so that's what the word nice was generally speaking attached to.
I had one
broad. It's much more complex than that. Yeah, it wasn't originally a good positive trait. No.
I had one guy trying to tell me, he knows us and our family. Oh, you guys are the nice Christians. You guys are the really good Christians. I just went, mate. Let me tell you, if you knew my family background, I'm an animal at heart. Okay, I am actually the lowest of the low. And it was only through the transformation of the Holy Spirit that is what you're seeing today.
Exactly.
Yeah. I would actually rob you if I was at my base.
I would exactly before Christ. Over. Yeah, correct.
Wow.
Nice is nice. I get why people look when someone says nice as a general principle. What they're really meaning is kind.
Yes.
The thing is that nice has become. The problem isn't so much that. So like nice is general. Nice now has shifted in its semantic meaning to kindness, sort of, kind of. But the problem is that niceness is then esteemed as a virtue. That's where the problem lies, right? And so, circling all the way back through, what ends up going on in this particular portion here, and this is the point I'm trying to draw, is that what happens with Christ is not nice, but it is good, ethically, morally. Don't be nice, be good, is the basic premise. Even the word meek, we would, and I'll finish on this point so that we can then get back to this text. But it ties in. It ties in the broader points that we're tangentially going along. Meek or meekness is a perfectly accurate translation of the word that gets used in Greek. The issue, though, is that by the time we're here now in the 21st century, meek has come to mean something very different than what it did.
No.
Self-deprecating.
That's
yes. Self-deprecating. Yes.
So meek is not weak.
No.
And it's not putting yourself beneath or below others.
No. Yeah, never was. Meek actually gets used, its equivalent term in the Old Testament gets used to describe instances in which God is being patient, for example. It's actually, in a really direct sense, the word in the Greek gets used in broader Greek literature to describe incredible strength being under control by discipline. Okay. At times, for example, in certain Greek literature, it's used to describe a warrior who is presented with a threat but chooses to keep his sword sheathed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Strength under control is really the heart of that word in Greek.
Like your gentle giants, the guys that could crush you easily.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, correct. But choose not to. And the analogy I use is usually with regard to my own, kind of my own setting. So I've trained in mixed martial arts for many years, and all kinds of different people train in fighting. Taller, bigger guys like myself, all the way down to very comparatively or relatively smaller guys. But usually the smaller guys are actually very good technically and can usually defeat guys much bigger than themselves.
Because they have to.
Because they have to focus on technique. Yeah, they don't have muscularity or strength to be able to wield around. But the point being is that they, or guys like me, guys like them, are really the last kind that ever actually get into physical fights. You never find guys like us getting into bar fights, for example, because the consequences. I'm just speaking something that's commonplace, right? Some fight that makes it on the news on the weekend, and that's because the consequences of guys who are trained in fighting, especially guys who are much better than me and who've been training much longer than me, the consequences for them getting into a fight, if they were not to hold back, is someone ending up in the morgue, dead. Yeah, dead. And because the difference between a man who knows how to fight and a man who doesn't know how to fight is the difference between night and day, right? And so even the Japanese, for example, Japan has laws, especially because Japan's home to many different fighting styles or martial arts. Japan has laws where if you are a trained martial artist, you'll actually have face a different penalty threshold and conviction rate. Punishment. So conviction. Yeah, basically. So if a trained martial artist in Japan injures a guy versus a guy who's not trained in martial arts, they'll get different penalties, because basically the Japanese ethos is that you should restrain yourself because you know how to fight. The point I'm trying to draw is that meekness, and this is especially when you find, especially because this, obviously the most famous reference to meekness is the meek shall inherit the earth, right, from the Beatitudes. Meekness, the only connection that meek has to weak is that it rhymes. And nothing more.
But also, meekness is connected to grace.
Yes.
And is also connected to humility. You know what you can do.
Yeah, humility. Well, that's the strength under control element.
Yeah. Whereas we think humility again is self-deprecation.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not. It's actually, I relate it to honesty. Right?
You mentioned, yeah.
You're not boasting. You're not trying to underrate. You're just saying, this is who I am. Standing in front of God. I'm
pretty sure you mentioned C.S. Lewis before. I think it was C.S. Lewis. It might have been G.K. Chesterton. I can't remember which of the two it would have been. But either C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton said that with regards to humility, I think it's 100% correct. I do think it was C.S. Lewis. But point being is that humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less.
Mm. Exactly.
Do you understand the difference?
Yeah.
Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. So in other words, stop thinking so much about yourself. Think of others. And then when a family, a clan, a community, etc., are thinking of everyone else, then everyone gets taken care of. Right? So the premise of what's occurring here is the confluence of economics and religion, and specifically the financial abuse of people. The reason why it's so particularly egregious, and this is where verse 26 and 27 make this kind of pretty apparent. If you read here, verse 26, again, just to refresh you the words in verse 25, men, you know our prosperity is from this business. Verse 26, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable crowd, saying that things made with hands are not gods. And so the whole purpose and point... That's fine. The whole problem is the fact that Paul, through his ministry, has converted many, many, many people away from the gods, away from particularly Artemis. And so it's putting a dent in their business, right? They literally that's how much of an impact they're having, right? The Christians. So many people are converting to Christianity that sales of idols are actually down, right? And it's actually impacting the economy of the city of Ephesus. Okay. Now, apart from the fact that that's cool, the main point that he then, this Demetrius, this silversmith, is then drilling into his fellow tradesmen and silversmiths and other such trades, is that the superstitious basis, right? So in other words, the basis, he's saying that these things made with hands, right, our silver statues and our marble statues and blah blah blah, are not actually gods. He's destroying the theological and metaphysical basis for our system, right? Human beings don't just do things unthinkingly on a general principle. Plenty of people do things unthinkingly, but on big societal levels, there's nothing unthinking about it. Every action is preceded by a thought or by ideas, and that is exactly the case here. The entire economy of Ephesus, and especially Ephesus, was built around the religious or the cultic system. Okay, Asia Minor generally, so this western portion of what today is Turkey, was very much the same in that regard. Pergamum, for example, was the heartland of the imperial cult outside of Rome. So the imperial cult, in other words, the worship of Caesar. Obviously, Rome was the heart of that, but then outside of Rome, outside the capital, the Pergamum was the biggest, the largest, the wealthiest, most successful, most renowned cultic center for the worship of the Caesars. Okay, so for example, like when you get into chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation, when he says to the church in Pergamum, it makes a reference to where Satan's throne is. He's making a passing reference to the Pergamites to the Pergamonian Christians that where Satan has his throne is in reference to the imperial cult in Pergamum, for example. Okay, so all the province of Asia, the Roman province of Asia, what geographically we call Asia Minor, or today Western Anatolia, Western Turkey, was a deeply religious part of the world. And Ephesus was really the heart of that, especially with regards to Artemisian worship. They're saying that, as in verse 26, they, Paul and co, are saying that things made with hands are not gods. They're destroying and they are unveiling and tearing away the entire theological and metaphysical basis for the religious system, and that therefore is also destroying the economic connection that we have to that, right? And so there's a couple of points that have been drawn here, which I'll mention after we read verse 27. And not only is there danger that this trade of ours will fall into disrepute, making idols, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be considered as worthless, and that she, whom all of Asia and the world worship, is even about to be brought down from her majesty.
They've got to realise that they're making these things, so they're not imbuing it with any sort of special power. How can they rationalise away that here's something that was an ingot, square ingot, and now I've poured into a mould, and now it's special?
because of the way in which, and this is getting to the heart of the kind of point that we draw here this morning, which is that with regards to false religious systems beyond or outside of the religion of God, there is a kind of fountain-esque trickle-down structure to the way that they almost always generally work. Namely that built upon the foundation of the masses of people in that tribe, in that culture, in that whatever it happens to be, who are not running the system, the religion, etc. They're not actually the ones who formulate ideas. They're not the ones who write anything. They're the participants. They're the quote unquote consumers. Consumers in this sense. They are the followers of. Okay. In order to support this kind of religious and economic system and institution, you have to have masses of people. In order to then actually get to that point again, this takes centuries and centuries of cultural development, of course, millennia even, thousands of years of cultural development. But nonetheless, the participation of different parts of society in the system will A, look different in how that participation occurs, and B, I suppose more importantly to this point, will look different with regards to the reasons for participation. Do you understand? So the point you're making there, which is correct, is that Demetrius isn't even faintly concerned, at least not in the way that he's speaking here, isn't even faintly concerned with the actual metaphysical truth of Artemis. Does that make sense? He's not actually concerned with that. He's not actually concerned with, is all this worship actually true and right and good? Whereas in the West over the last 2,000 years, that has become the point, because that's exactly the point that gets made in here, right? Is that it's not just about what is suitable or useful to us. It's actually about us conforming ourselves to what's true, not the other way around. Does that make sense? Truth shouldn't be conforming to us and our expectations, our beliefs, our feelings, our desires, whatever. We're meant to conform ourselves to the truth. Hence, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Because the truth is not merely just an abstract idea or concept. The truth is actually a person, and the truth is called Jesus Christ. Right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so Demetrius here isn't, in what he says, isn't even concerned at all with the actual reality of Artemis, with the reality, right? It's not that he thinks it's all a load of rubbish, right? He makes the point in the end of verse 27, and even is about to be brought down from her majesty, right? So he is making an apology, or in other words, a defense for keeping Artemis in the esteem that the Ephesians have previously held her to.
But is he just playing to the ears that are listening?
Correct, that's the question. Exactly.
I think so.
Exactly, that's the point I'm trying to draw, yeah. Is that his concerns are with his concerns are with the economic system and institutions of Ephesus. That's it.
If she doesn't have her majesty, he's got no business.
He's out of business.
Because there's no...
That's the point. Correct. Yeah, everyone's correct here. Yes, that's the entire point of what I'm trying to draw. And he shows his hand because, well, he shows his hand by two ways. He shows his hand by, in the end of verse 26, with his main gripe with Paul and the Christians, or just the Christians generally. His primary gripe with the Christians, and with Paul specifically as their leader, is that they are saying that things made with hands are not gods. Right, so the statues and the temple and blah blah blah.
That's the end of his business.
That's the philosophical underpinning of the entire economic system of Ephesus. Is that okay? That the things that we make, the idols, the temples, the blah 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 blah, are all actually deities and are efficacious. And so the prayers, the sacrifices, the festivals, the holy days, all of the people who travel from all around Asia and the rest of the eastern portions of the empire, in fact, probably from even around the entire empire, because I'm saying this is the heart, this is literally the heart of the cult of Artemis. Okay, you're an Artemisian priest over in the province of Hispania in Spain. Well, you would make pilgrimage all the way over to Ephesus at some point, right?
It's like Mecca for Artemis.
I suppose, yeah, if you want to think that way, yeah. Ephesus is the heart of Artemisian worship, and so especially in this side of the world. And so, point being is that then imagine all the rest of the flow on with regards to economics, the trade. How many idols and other such things built in Ephesus were then obviously manufactured in Ephesus and then sold to other parts around the empire, and the system of trade, because then the supply chain of idols moving from Ephesus to all portions of the world. You're talking about merchants, you're talking about ship captains, you're talking about travel, you're talking about those who would obviously distribute them on land. You're talking about then having, of course, because they're valuable, then you're talking about soldiers or warriors who would then protect those statues and protect the merchants traveling. There's all this flow on of economics.
In Ephesus, they'd have people...
Tourism? Yep.
Yeah, so you'd have people having food stalls.
Food stores.
For the
hotels and whatnot. People, yep. All that kind of stuff. The whole box and dice.
There's no stronger witness than the witness of your enemies when he actually says Paul has convinced and led astray huge numbers of people here, and practically the whole province of Asia. So the witness of the spread of the gospel at a time by this guy who hates it. Yeah,
and by the way, again, this is where imagination is not the right word, but just experience. Reading between the lines, not reading into it, that we shouldn't do, but reading between the lines, getting the gist of things is important. When you read basically verses 25 to 27, you shouldn't be imagining someone having a nice monotone conversation over a cup of coffee. Does that make sense? This guy's not just like having a casual chat, like he's angry here, right? This would be a very stern, serious discussion he's having with the other workers and craftsmen and businessmen from Ephesus. Does that make sense? So reading between the lines is what I mean. Not reading into it, but reading between the lines. There is an entire economic and cultural system that's built around the religious element of everything I mentioned, from trade to mercantilism to the tourism, everything else, from the marketplaces, food stalls, inns and hotels and places for people to stay, and all these kinds of things that then are tied up with all those various factors, right? We here in Katoomba should know that as well as anyone with regards to tourism and everything else that gets built up around tourism. He called all the craftsmen and the workmen in related trades. Exactly. It's not. That's the point I made earlier. Yeah, exactly. It's not just the silversmiths. He's got an entire crowd here of a massive crowd of all kinds of businessmen and craftsmen and so on and so forth from around the city. This is just like a massive crowd. He must have had some social standing to be able to he must have, correct. The fact that he's mentioned by name would indicate that. We have no idea who he is beyond this portion. Like, it's not like he's mentioned... Statue maker, head silver. Or just, could be. The guilds were an established thing in Ephesian culture. And so he's probably, again, reading between the lines, he's probably the head of the silversmith guild. Mm-hmm. Also, just what you said before, I mean, I know we're not up to that. No, it's on you. But just when you were saying it's not like they're sitting around having a cup of coffee, if you... From 28 through, right at the end it says they were shouting for 2 hours. Because they were furious, And they realised that they're all, like, you can, if you... Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like bedlam, actually. No, it's a massive, and they're in the theatre of Ephesus, which was huge as well. The amphitheatre of Ephesus is massive. It's very big by comparative standards. And you can see the remnants of it if you ever go there. But
It's on YouTube. I looked all that up.
Yeah, you can also fortunately save yourself thousands of dollars of airline flights and just look it up online.
I love the saying.
Mugs like me can just tell you what it looks like in person.
Most of the people did not even know why they were there. I was just in the crowd, man.
Well, we're going to get into all that next week in the next lesson about this beautiful example of mob democracy that we're about to watch unfold in these last kind of verses here, of whipping the mob up, of mobs and of people emotively gathering together, not based where reason kind of exited stage left long ago. We'll cover that next week though. So the point that's being drawn here is that, and this is what I really want you to see. Everything that Demetrius is saying here, and then especially what you see in the next lesson, okay, especially then, which is the practical ramifications of all this, is all traces the whole series of things, the whole chronology of it, traces itself back to really an idea. Namely, these statues are not gods. There's only one God. Right? There is only one king. There is only one God. He is triune, and he's not in these statues. Right? Now, that's the kernel of the idea. It's much, obviously, it's infinitely more complex than that, and the ramifications of it philosophically are endless. But what I want you to see from what he's saying here, particularly in these verses 25 through 27, is that what Paul and the Christians have done is they have literally and figuratively uprooted the actual theological and philosophical basis, the ideas that underpinned the corrupt pagan system of in this case, Ephesus, but also more broadly, because he uses a bit of hyperbole, but whom all of Asia and the world worship, or even going back further into regards to what Paul does. In verse 26, and you see and hear not only in Ephesus but in almost all of Asia, right? So around all the other parts that, like the seven churches of Asia, as we call them, in Revelation 2 and 3, Philadelphia, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, blah blah blah, that they have been destroying the philosophical and theological basis for the pagan worship, because at the end of the day, that's what it actually means. When, for example, that very same apostle says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities and forces of darkness and so on and so forth. Paul here is basically, and those who are with him, the Christians, but obviously being led by Paul, so that's why he just refers to Paul. Paul is in the process of single-handedly bringing the entire Ephesian city to its knees, economically, religiously, politically, without spilling one drop of blood.
Well, the whole city was in an uproar. It says.
Yep, it's a huge crowd, and we'll go into the nature of that next week. But it's a huge crowd in the theatre there, without drawing his sword even once. He's bringing Ephesus to its knees, right? And there's many, again, we talk about this for a long time. This is an extremely deep passage, but the basics of it is what really needs to be grasped. The saying, obviously, in English, the pen is mightier than the sword, and that has an interesting history to it. But the basis of that idiom is that ideas are ultimately more powerful and more transformative to a culture or a civilization than any military conquest can possibly be. The world has had a very recent first-hand experience of what military might can reap upon the world in regards to the world wars, the two world wars, and at the end of the day, really, whilst of course there was military success, no ideologies were completely and utterly destroyed. Sadly and unfortunately, the communists were on our side during that Second War.
Not originally, though.
Not originally, but you're right, not originally, after the Berlin Conference and so on, blah, blah. But then eventually were on our side.
Only because they had to.
Yeah, well, you're correct. But Nazism as an ideology isn't eradicated, and you're not going to ever eradicate it by military means. Communism has evolved and changed significantly, but its broader Marxist roots and the kind of modern neo-Marxist evolutions of that ideology are absolutely alive and well. Despite a Cold War, despite the USSR falling, obviously in 89 and whatnot, in 1990, those ideologies haven't gone anywhere. Because at the end of the day, ideas are not actually conquered by military force or by military might. Because you can't shoot ideas out of people.
That's why fascists and dictators want to control thinking. They don't want people to have.
Yeah, correct. Exactly. Nazism did that. Communism did and does that.
Chinese.
Exactly. And so because they understand full well that it's actually the ideas that are able to conquer entire civilizations.
But are we doing this in the Western world with newspapers and?
Yeah, the nature of how these things work is that it's not a question of, to backtrack, I'll use one example that describes how this works. So propaganda as a term, certainly at least in how it was originally used, was actually a surprisingly neutral term. Propaganda simply meant it didn't mean anything. It didn't mean automatically bad. Didn't mean automatically good. It was simply basically used as a term of means or a term of mechanism. When we think of propaganda, of course, we naturally think of all the negative propaganda, which is true and accurate, right? We think of
advertising is a type
lies
of
and deceit.
advertising is a type of propaganda.
Yeah, advertising is exactly a type of
like
propaganda.
not happy jam. I mean that's
yeah,
right
correct.
from Australian culture.
Exactly. Even to this day, it's a bit less now, but if you go back to and find any wedding ring from the De Beers, yeah. Find any wedding ring from basically World War II onward, even to this day, and obviously the absolute vast preponderance of them, 97, 98, 99% of them, have diamonds. Which is interesting because no one ever really gave a hoot about diamonds historically. Diamonds really were
worthless,
almost worthless at certain points in certain cultures. Yeah. The success of the diamond industry came from one of the most successful marketing or advertising campaigns from a South African diamond company called De Beers, who came up with a very intelligent phrase, "Diamonds are a girl's best friend."
Or diamonds are forever is another one.
And diamonds are, that was the Tiffany's. Yeah, correct. Yeah. And that single-handedly, that one single advertising campaign completely revolutionised the jewel industry. Fortunately, most people are not actually aware of how many of those diamonds from De Beers were blood diamonds, but that's a different issue altogether. Point being that. That's a form of propaganda. So again, the advertising move, the massive American advertising industry of the 1950s, 1960s.
Well,
propaganda.
How much lithium is actually blood lithium?
Yeah, correct. How many? Yeah, exactly, correct.
One of the biggest propaganda things was the tulip in.
Yeah.
Oh, tell us.
Tulips. Like that was. Yeah. Well, I don't know a heap about this. You probably would know more. But apparently there was when tulips came to Holland. It was like suddenly it was the in thing and built up to be this wonderful flower. So the super rich were bringing them in. They cost a fortune.
Yeah.
Fortune.
Yeah, correct.
And it was all about tulips.
Yeah, correct.
I mean, you can do it about anything. You could do it, you know.
Yeah, correct.
And especially in this day and age where we've got technology and stuff. But even back then, that was in the 17th or 16th.
A bit earlier it really is beginning of the 17th century, so beginning of the 1600s, and so that's where the Dutch reformed. It's more broadly now the concept of the theological concept of TULIP as an acronym: total depravity, unconditional election, limited or particular atonement, and so on and so forth. That's where that comes from, because it was associated with the Dutch Reformed Church, and this was right at the time when tulips were becoming the Dutch thing.
Apple has a similar thing, you know.
Yeah, good point.
Apple's superior to everything else, you know. You've got to have an Apple phone every 18 months.
Yeah, well, it's Apple or all the other Androids. So it's
others,
Apple or non-Apple phones is the dichotomy.
Is it all Apple computers and non-Apple computers?
Yeah, correct, same deal. And so all of that, and so the point that's being drawn here is that all the economics, the politics, the cultural things, blah blah blah, all flow back from ideas. Okay, every action is preceded by an idea. That's why I've explained, using a kind of tripartite little analogy that I use, that politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from religion or worship. Right? Ideas. When I say religious, it doesn't just mean an established religion. I mean worship, or in other words, what people think, philosophy, theology, whatever happens to be.
Can you just say that again?
Yeah. Politics is downstream from culture.
Yes.
And culture is downstream from worship.
I can understand the worship and culture, but I just never made that link between culture and politics.
Yeah, often it's thought about the other way, that the politics impacts the culture, but really the culture is what then influences and builds the politics. And that was true before the modern democratic republican kind of ideal in the West.
What would you define the culture as then?
Yeah, so the culture, good question. So the culture, in this analogy or in this idiom, I'm defining it. Well, I define all three of them broadly, but the culture I'm defining broadly as, again, still connected to the worship, but the culture I'm defining as standards and expectations.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So when we have so especially in regards to cultural norms or cultural mores, but again, because I'm using this analogy of a stream, there's no. So what's the clear line between the worship and the actual cultural institutions or elements? Well, there is no clear line, just like there's no clear line in the river. They flow. So, for example, the cultural practices are built off of mores or values, right? So that's in one sense in which you can then see that culture is downstream from worship. But again, they're not just like these blocks, these monolithic blocks. There's a flow and a confluence, literally and figuratively, between them.
It's like our culture has its roots in Christianity.
Yes, correct. Yep.
But I've not been to other countries, but they have different cultures.
Yep.
But still, they've got their roots in Christianity, particularly a lot of European countries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But then, if you look at like Chinese, their culture is totally different, and totally different worship.
Yeah, correct. And so what you would then see, and again, yes, I'm saying, so that's my point about them not being monolithic. Like there's a kind of a flow between these various elements.
Okay.
But with regards to the cultural, so the link between the cultural and the political, which is the primary point there, is that the politics and the kind of political expectations, and then how the parameters in which the politics actually play out, is not what informs the cultural understanding, the cultural practices, the culture. It's actually the other way around. So the barrier or the realm in which the politics is played out is because of the cultural expectations of what we think politics should be, what we think the politician should do, what we think the king should embody, blah 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 blah.
They should do and what they do.
Yeah, blah blah blah. Exactly, that's my point. And so there's these, and so the politic. That's especially true in democratic or republican systems. It is also true in monarchies, though. In monarchies, that's also again true, especially wherein the king is held as the kind of embodiment of the nation. Which is a valuable
representative on earth in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and where there's value in those, especially in the embodiment of the nation. Kind of, that he's meant to embody the best of us. He's meant to carry himself a certain way. He's meant to conduct himself. All those kind of things. There's value in all those things. But even therein, what the king, the common misconception about, medieval monarchies, for example, so like before the time of kind of absolute monarchies of the 1600s, the common misconception is, for example, that basically the king just kind of sat around being fed grapes and just telling people what to do. No, no. There was always an antidote to the tyranny of a king, and it usually resulted in not well. Yeah, it usually resulted in him getting ahead of himself, and by ahead of himself, I mean losing his head.
And it wasn't just France. I mean, that happened in England too.
No, it wasn't just France. No, no. Absolute tyrannical kings often found themselves dead on a battlefield.
Okay. Just push you to the front of the line. Right.
Well, yeah, the tyranny. When a king turned tyrannical, those situations tended to resolve themselves more times than not.
The lords would just say, "We'll just hang back here a minute."
Yeah, correct. Because monarchy in the medieval period wasn't actually about like an absolute overlordship. It was actually about subsidiarity, and you couldn't. And the king was dependent on the nobles, who were dependent on the commons, who were dependent on the nobles, who were dependent on the king, right? And so, yeah, the point that I'm drawing back here is this. Yeah, I'm not the only one who's phrased it this way. I didn't come up with the concept, but politics downstream from culture, culture downstream from worship, because of the way that ideas build practices, not the other way around. The practices, sometimes, don't get me wrong, people can have practices that they then kind of use a kind of post hoc rationalization to like justify themselves. But even then, it's not really, because what's really going on there is that a practice is being led. Actually, I think I mentioned this in like the last couple of weeks. I mentioned that Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury during the Reformation in England in the 16th century, had a brilliant way of phrasing this. He's the one whose prayer we use at the beginning of these studies. And if I can remember it correctly, what the heart desires, the mind, no, I need to go back. What the heart desires, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. Yeah, what the heart desires, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. Okay, and that's he's talking in a negative sense. He's not saying that's a positive thing, right?
It's more observational if you just
it's observational, right?
You'd see it all the time.
Yeah, what the heart desires.
I'm writing this down.
Fair enough. What the heart desires,
I'll forget that.
the will chooses, and the mind justifies. So that's what we would call a post hoc rationalization, or just simply an after the fact rationalization.
Okay.
It's where you do something and then you after the fact, as you're doing it, you then kind of backfill in the reasons for why, the justification. You're just trying to justify something, right? Exactly correct.
So if every country's politics is based on their culture, which has been based on their beliefs.
Yeah, beliefs. Yeah, you can also say beliefs there. Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Then the actual, I always thought that politics was the same in all countries, so diplomacy was pretty easy. You all had common ground. But what you're actually saying is it's nigh impossible because politics will be so
global well, yeah, correct. The reason, there's a reason why so modern geopolitics is often, you often see like you see a gathering at the UN, and you've got 150 something nations who are actually gathered there and whatever, blah blah blah, or 200 with their observers and whatnot, and they're all sitting around and it's nice and civilized and blah blah. But then people kind of tend to just in the middle of that, or in all the state visits around the world and international diplomatic things and people forget there's really only one broad prevailing reason why that's happening. Everyone's terrified of the United States military.
That's true.
It really is that simple.
It's true.
Like at the end of the day, the basis of the fact is that if the United States military was a quarter of the size that it is, the world would look a lot different. Right?
I mean, I tell people the only country that could successfully invade Australia, because it has the logistics to do so, is the US.
Is the US, yes, correct.
Even China can do it.
No, people, exactly. People don't understand how difficult it is to conduct.
The only country that's ever used a nuclear weapon, like a nuclear bomb.
Yeah, correct. Obviously, in World War II. Yeah.
You mean as in used it on another country?
In war. Yeah, correct. The reality, the reason why the world can the kind of global economy that we have at the moment, the reason why it can kind of chug along without utterly imploding, and it's a dumpster fire, but it's still chugging along. The reason why it can chug along, even though the default fiat currency of the world, the US dollar, isn't backed by anything, and like because
it's fiat, yeah.
It's fiat. They took
no precious metals.
No precious metals. President Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard back in 1970.
And every other country followed suit.
Yeah, and basically the US dollar became a big IOU. The reason why that's the case is because although the US currency is not actually backed by any commodity like gold, because it hasn't been since 1971, it is backed by something, and it's called the United States military. That's what it's backed by. It's backed by the United States military. The US military power is what backs.
The EU would be coming up close to being able to stabilise out. Let's say, for example, Trump got elected again.
Sure.
US goes into a total dumpster fire, or even worse.
Even more than it is now, maybe.
Yeah. So would the next stabilising world power currency would be the EU, possibly?
The yen would be the only thing that even be probable that would even be remotely capable, but even then it would fail. No, it would be a train wreck. As soon as the US dollar stops becoming the global fiat, the global reserve currency.
Because
it's difficult to even actually describe the
US belief is we are the winners and we always win. Okay, it's not Christianity. It's just we win.
The Americans,
wherever we go, we will win.
Yeah. And that's exactly to my point about politics being downstream from culture, being downstream from belief, right? So the politics, UN, is all built upon the back-ended idea of American exceptionalism. Which in many respects is true, but in others not so much. But it depends on what you're talking about, right? But the beliefs are what always then inform the actions after the fact. And so to conclude the point here, because this is really the kind of conclusionary point of what we looked at this morning, is that the Ephesian economy is being turned upside down because Paul is single-handedly dismantling the entire theological and philosophical basis on which the whole thing's actually built. And this can give us 1,000 lessons of A, what's going on now, and then B, also how to fix it. Because the problem that exists in modern Western civilization is also actually the pathway out. Namely, that the West is facing the problems it faces today because of a shift in ideas. Okay? Since the Enlightenment, the West has been continually and progressively and expansively abandoning the Christian religion and God on a personal level, Christianity with regards to all of its values, its precepts, its mores, its ethos, etc. And that when you change those ideas, you will inevitably change the entire landscape of a culture because the culture is downstream from the beliefs or the ideas or the worship. And so then when you see the end state or the kind of symptoms of political turmoil and infighting in the country and blah, 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 all of that's just the symptoms. Even the more egregious things, again, things like the current culture of the last 50 to 100 years in the West of regarding abortion. Again, all of that practice, the amount of blood that's been shed, all prevails from a set of ideas.
Yeah, look, you need to go further upstream.
Yeah, correct.
The actual view of, it's okay if I get pregnant, I can get rid of it. Well, no, the idea is, a bit of chastity, thanks.
Yeah, and responsibility, and the natural consequences of being shocked and surprised that when you participated in the thing that is designed to bring childbirth, that you actually, as a result, ended up in a state of childbirth. It's about as surprising as jumping out of an airplane without a parachute and then being shocked and astonished when you plummet into the earth. Well, you did the thing that results in you plummeting into the earth, which is called jumping out of an airplane.
I don't actually, because I don't, so I don't always think I think it can be used as contraception, unfortunately. I think that there are women that are raped and become pregnant.
Small numbers.
Yeah.
Very
They
small.
exist.
I mean,
so
apart from...
just hear me out.
Yeah.
I acknowledge that, okay? And I am not going to go there because that's a horror in so many ways.
Yep.
But, and to be honest with you, it's something that I think, and I don't want to sound all...
No, go for it.
But it's a woman's having that perpetrated on you, it's just, I can't even...
World altering, yeah.
That would, and then fall pregnant from that is just another horror. So I'm not going to go there with that. You're right, I think. What I don't understand is when you look at it, even take away all of our, just for a moment, put our belief system aside, and you look at it biologically, and you ask yourself the question, well, where does life begin? Even when I was furthest away from my faith, that was one thing I could never justify to myself. I couldn't think, well, it's life begins here or here or here. Even after a baby is born at full term, it is not self-sufficient. So do we abort it then? You could argue that right back down to...
Well, that's an argument that's being made now.
So for me, the argument is, of course, it's a faith thing, because I don't, for me, but it's also a biological argument. That to me, I can't... And someone says, oh no, it's at this week because that's when the lungs are formed. And then you go to different countries. In Germany, for example, you can abort babies almost full term.
We shouldn't even be at the point where we have to define where life begins.
Exactly. Because it's decreed.
This is downstream from the further ideas that came upstream, right? It's
that is my point, but yeah.
Yeah, so we're now facing ethical dilemmas that we should have never had to face.
Yes.
That's the operative thing, because this is where, and this is something that I mentioned earlier. This is something that G.K. Chesterton definitely did say, which is that nations tend to fall when people start forgetting obvious things. Okay.
Like is God.
Yes, correct. And when does life begin?
And none of these things. Stable family unit.
Yeah, all those.
Totally destroyed.
Yep, correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly. Because we also wouldn't be facing these dilemmas.
We'd be having incest, rape,
in stable family scenarios, and in scenarios where because understand that today, there are men and women in prison for statutory rape, and they're in there for 5 years. Okay. Understand that in the West historically, if you go back a couple hundred years, and you were found guilty of rape, you're dead.
You're not even allowed to use.
That's the death. It's the death penalty.
I don't even know how to.
It's deeper than just the physical. Correct.
You're not allowed to use that word, by the way. In courts, it's called sexual assault.
Yeah,
you can't use rape.
Yeah, they don't even call it rape anymore. Correct. Yeah. And so understand that there was the standard of justice rightfully, because again like I mentioned with regards to death when it came up in a fortnight ago when it was in the sermon, the scriptures only has one. As far as God's concerned, there is exactly one just punishment for murder, for the taking of someone else's life, and that's the death penalty. And rape also has the exact same punishment. When a man rapes a woman or vice versa, obviously the majority is one way. But this holds it in such a level of egregious evil that the death penalty is what is prescribed for it. And so this is kind of where, and this is some food for thought. Again, it doesn't need to be a discussion. I know you didn't want to have one, which is fine. but the food for thought I leave on that, because I understand the kind of exception for scenarios of rape, because I understand how. I know you're not. It's something that's difficult to think. That's all I meant, because I've had plenty of conversations along those lines. Here's the food for thought I generally leave with people. Who actually ends up getting administered the proverbial death penalty? For those who would argue that against abortion, except for instances of rape, is that who actually ends up getting the death penalty has been flipped around. Because I would actually argue that we shouldn't live in a society where the innocent child has to die as a result of the sins of their father. I actually think the father should be put to death for having raped the mother of that, the now mother of that child.
The trouble is that the perpetrator will actually be detrimental to society for the rest of that perpetrator's life, and whatever else he actually does to influence others.
Yeah, correct.
I think because we live in an imperfect world, I think we've all done things that God would not have planned for us to do, and we make those decisions at the time for all sorts of reasons. And I've known women that have had abortions, and I'm not judging them. I'm not. I mean, it's not my job to. But I talk for myself. If people ask me they're the two things I go back on. I know God does not want it, but also for me, it's also a biological. If you can tell me where life begins, and then we can have that.
Fortunately,
should we even try to legislate it? It's just not. It's not right to actually even think that we can do that.
But God gives.
Yeah.
God gives life.
Yeah.
Not us. We shouldn't have that choice.
That's where our ability to take it away.
Exactly where that, a woman who's been raped and is pregnant and has the child goes to do some amazing things.
Yeah, it happens all the time. Yeah, and that's the basic point. Is that what we end up doing by that? Yeah, the one critical point I ask people to think of if they're feeling uneasy about what about situations of rape is you have to then try and come up with a rationalisation of why that child deserves to suffer for the sins of its father, for the sins of the father.
I usually tell people,
and the point I make is that it doesn't. You can't actually. It's the same lack of ability to justify. Why does this child, for some reason, now deserve to not live?
Well, I tell people I shouldn't exist. I should have been aborted. In my
I know.
My situation.
I know a dozen people my age who are in the exact same position.
Yeah.
You're out of your life because
it wasn't available or legal at the time. But I wouldn't be existing. Yeah,
catch off. That's fine. Yeah, head off. Yeah, that's fine.
Thanks. See ya.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The it starts, but see how this all is again. So the actions, what gets done culturally, and then the legislation. That's the politics. All downstream from what we actually believe is going on. Do you know what I'm saying? It all comes back to the beliefs. When does life begin is against my point about Chesterton, against nations fall when people start forgetting obvious things. It's astonishingly obvious when it begins. Again, there's no biology textbook in the world has any other concept than in the unification of the gametes, right? Of egg and of spermatozoa or of sperm. There's no other concept of when, there's no question as to when this new biological entity, this new creature actually exists. And so the debate, and this is where, again, the whole concept of ideas, debating around when central nervous system starts developing to a certain level, or when we can actually register a heartbeat, again, which is largely dependent on our technological ability to actually measure it, not so much what happens biologically. When motor neuron functions have started to develop, all these kinds of biological questions are all actually a semantic game of trying to justify how late or early we think we can do it. Because none of this actually overturns the simple, completely basic biological fact that any 7th grade biology student could learn, which is the unification of the gametes is the beginning, i.e. conception, is the beginning of life. There's no debate around that. It then becomes a debate downstream in the culture and the politics when we're trying to justify our actions.
Well, even if we had technology where we could teleport the fetus into an in vitro chamber and grow them up without any sort of interference of the mother or father, or the ultimate convenience, that child becoming an adult still will have the desire to find their biological parents,
of course, which
would be a great inconvenience to them.
Yeah, correct. All those kind of things.
The thing, like if you look at a lot of other species, those young, the little babies, they're born, like let's say giraffes, right? Or foals, they get up straight away and they're walking and they're off. They're almost, other than being fed by the mum, they're pretty much self-sufficient. Our babies because our birth canals are too small.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
We're born
Utterly.
almost premature.
Oh, yeah.
And the
Yeah.
head's
Yeah.
all squished in, that's why
Yep.
we've got all these things, so it can fit through.
That's why the
birth.
skull's not actually set in place yet.
But if
Yeah.
you-
So when we come out, we are nowhere ready and independent to be by ourselves. So these people that argue, oh, well, you just go back down the line a bit and then it's okay.
To the level of viability.
It's not
Not
okay
okay, no.
either.
But if you look at
that's
like
so
lions or chimpanzees, right? They'll kill the offspring of another father.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, there are species where it's bad. I mean, hyenas, for example, the newborn offspring, obviously born in litter form, and so you've got multiple births in the same period. Those offspring fight like literally immediately for survival,
Yeah.
and then the ones that actually survive that fight when they're like literally seconds out of the womb actually are the ones
A
that
lot of
survive.
birds.
It's
same
wild.
thing. Who could push who out of the nest?
Yeah.
Same
It's
deal.
wild, and that's a mark of that's a demarcation between humans and between the animal kingdom. But yeah, the point, your point there is that. But see, this is my whole point about beliefs leading to actions, is that there are jurisdictions in the United States where that's actually being advocated for. So in California and other states, certain elements of the Congress of Virginia, for example, the former governor. Said point blank that when that child is born, there should be a kind of 30-day moratorium where her and her doctor can then decide whether she wants to keep it or not. Post-birth, I'm talking about, not pre. I'm talking post-birth.
I saw an article advertising, arguing that the neonate
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
is as much not a person yet.
because this is where.
Well, see that they're arguing against. That was my point. Is that should not happen because of that.
Whereas the same, they're actually saying the opposite. So what they're saying, what that position argues for, but this is my whole point about beliefs, is that what we're doing. This is why it's such. This is why especially Christian ministers, my position. But this should be again. This is really the Christian perspective for those who are actually taking this seriously. Is that in regards to just abortion, yes or no at all? Is that it is a level of rationalization that is directly, and I'm not being like hyperbolic, I mean this in the literal sense, directly philosophically equivalent to the exact same philosophical rationalizations that underpinned, for example, Southern kind of Democrat antebellum slavery in the US, pre-Civil War. It's the exact same philosophical premise that underpinned the views of the Nazi Party regarding non-Aryan races, right? Namely, if you go back to the antebellum South, so pre-US, early 1800s America, up to the Civil War in 1861 to 1865, the common misconception today is that they didn't think that Africans were human beings. Common misconception, very common misconception, right? And this is not a justification. I'm actually trying to show you what they did actually think. They weren't idiots. They knew that their African slaves were actually human beings as opposed to being just some animal species. The issue wasn't about humanity or humanness. The issue was around a similar yet distinct category of personhood. Okay, that these our African slaves are not actually worthy of the same status of personhood as we are. Therefore, we can justify our chattel enslavement of them. Okay, this is evidenced by a number of things. For example, again, there was a constitutional agreement brought in with regards to how many of the African slaves the southern states, Georgia, Kentucky, etc., blah, blah, the Carolinas and whatnot, could count with regards to their voting population. And the agreement was what was called the 3/5 compromise. Again, common modern misconception is that the South only thought that the Africans were like 3/5 human. That wasn't the view. The view was, again, that you were able to count 3/5 of those African slaves. The point was that African slaves were considered subhuman, and that's where we get that term, right? Subhuman. Not non-human, subhuman, right? And so this is what the Germans would call Untermensch.
Yeah, Untermensch.
Okay. Subhuman. So non-Aryan races,
Jews, they thought the
Jews, Slavs, Celts,
all of
blah 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 blah
yeah.
blah, right? Non-Germanic races were Untermensch, as opposed to them
People with disabilities.
yeah, all those kinds. Yeah, the categories were racial and typological, blah blah. As opposed to them, the embodiment of Nietzsche's Übermensch, or the hyperman or the superman, which is what they were, and so subhumanity. No one is really standing around questioning whether it's a human being in the womb, as opposed to something like a giraffe or a cat. Like, I know it seems trivial, but that's the point. The battle is over personhood. Is this creature in the womb of the mother actually worthy of personhood and therefore life and rights and protections? And the prevailing opinion of those who are pro-abortion, either passively or actively, is that no, they're not.
But also it's also a loss of perspective in that they argue the people that need abortion, like the people incest or rape, but that's a very small amount.
Shockingly,
of
less than
people who are
1%.
actually
It's
going for
astonishingly small
abortion.
percent. Yeah, correct.
The majority are just doing it out of convenience, which is a whole, that's not being said. Nobody's
you're
actually
correct.
arguing.
Even though it's an established fact, like there is multiple self-surveys. So, like, in other words, we're not like where you're actually, it's a self-reporting. So, which is actually getting the insight from the person as to why they are or are not. Pew Research in the United States, for example, there's a whole variety of different reputable surveys and studies on this particular phenomenon that well north of 95% are categorized as elective / no reason.
Yeah.
What that means is
that's the crime.
Yeah, that's what I'm, and that's the scenario where I'm just going to use something generic, which would happen all the time. I'm 20 years old. I'm in university. I'm busy studying. I have a job, and I can't allow maternity to affect me and my career progression. Ergo, action. Right?
Yeah.
But again, the complete loss of perspective of you were apparently adult enough and responsible enough to do the very thing, the one and only, literally the only thing in life that can actually produce a child, but then for some reason you're not responsible enough to actually have the consequences of the very one thing that actually produces life. The complete disconnect. It's an act of selfishness that's actually difficult to even conceptualize in words, right?
Yeah, but like the culture is like that. It's such a horrible. You can't expect people not to have sex.
That's the cultural standard that we now live with. Yeah, correct. And that's the thing. It's then built around culture. So the politics, the legislation, coming down from cultural expectations, what I was highlighting earlier, and that coming downstream from, again, the way that the cultural expectations are built, what the actual values and ethos are built upon the beliefs.
But the ease of contraception for both male and females is so easily accessible. There's no excuse either to allow.
Well, exactly, and that's even before discussing. Before even discussing the nature of contraceptives. Yeah. These days, it's absolutely not even one single solitary. So I'm saying there's literally not one single solitary excuse for it. But that's kind of the point, is that almost becomes in itself like a kind of self-evident judgment. And it's not because, again, this is where we get lost in the kind of way that this gets discussed, is that what I'm saying here can be backed by science on the biological side of the equation. It can be backed by reason on everything I've just said. It can be backed by, of course, its mooring in Scripture. And yet, what I'm saying here would absolutely, and not would, is, by my vast experience in having discussions along these lines, is overwhelmingly decried as hateful, bigoted, every other possible slanderous term. Slanderous other possible term, yeah, correct.
Yeah, ignorant. You're obviously ignorant. You don't
obviously
know the reality of it.
Yeah, you don't understand the reality of it. Oh, you just want women to be nothing but wombs that produce, and you don't want, and you don't You don't do anything you Christians don't do anything to help women, even though we're the ones who run almost every single pregnancy crisis centre. But apart from that fact, ignore that reality. The vast majority of adoption agencies are Christian. Ignore that reality. The vast majority of charities, church, hospitals, Christian hospitals are Christian. The vast majority of people who actually adopt children are Christians. Again, all the reality. I'm saying, but because the reality is not the concern. Yeah. It's the same thing as the triviality of the semantic kind of sophistry that gets played out between the word baby and fetus, right? Well, it's not a baby; it's a fetus. Which is all you've done is just
miscarriage. Tell a mother who has a miscarriage. It's a fetus.
Oh, it's just a fetus. No, correct. But this is my point. But this is my point about the disconnect. See,
it's like the whole argument about transgender in sports. Over the whole history of sports, there have only ever been 2 transgenders that have competed, and both of them did so poorly they might as well come in last. And that hasn't stopped those people talking about, we can't have transgenders in sport. And you guys just haven't even seen the history.
Yeah, correct. The basis is the fact that this is what we do as people. Unfortunately, is that we again, I circle back to Thomas Cranmer's words. What the heart desires, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. Right, but it all begins with the heart desiring. Right. What we want to do as opposed to what we ought to do, right? That delineation between want and ought, or want and should, is what then, when you take that tiny little thing on the personal level and then multiply that out to the level of entire nations and civilizations, the consequences of that difference between want and should, or want and ought, is multiplied exponentially. And that's where you get entire civilizational issues from, of people unmooring themselves from their own cultural heritage, B, unmooring themselves from objective truth, i.e. from God, who is the actual objective standard, not we human beings who are subjective and who are flailed about by our own emotions and our desires. And then when you lose that mooring, you just become a ship adrift in the night, and that's exactly where we are. And so that's probably a good place to jump off. The whole point this morning here in this text, the ideas, the philosophical, metaphysical, theological underpinnings of Ephesus were being uprooted by Christianity, and so their economic system was now. And and obviously, as you're going to see as it flows out the next week, or the next lesson, the consequences of what happens is that, again, to not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities and against forces of darkness. This is what it's talking about. Paul hasn't drawn his sword once, and yet what he, and by extension the Christians now, those who have come to Christ, they themselves are now single-handedly uprooting the entire city of Ephesus without shedding one drop of blood, because this is what it means for Christ to conquer. It's the conquest of people's hearts and minds, bringing them out of darkness into light, bringing them out of chaos into order, bringing them out of evil into good, and you uproot evil ideas by conquering them with good. You overcome darkness with light. And that's what you're seeing play out here, an entire corrupt economic, religious system of profiting off of people's superstition and people's superstitious desires to have their crops work well. Well, I need to make sacrifice to this god and to that god, and I need to visit this priest, and I need to pay this much amount of money, and right? The whole corrupt system is being torn down in Ephesus at the very heart by Christ through Paul and the Christians. So we'll see the consequences of it in the end of the chapter in the next lesson. So there we go. Any final question or anything else?
Wait a whole week.
Oh no.
Well, you could go and start a riot and just come back with some empirical observations if you want.
I suppose, yeah. Oh dear. Thank you.